Yeah, go ahead and have a seat. So that microphone's on. You can adjust it however you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and swear you in, so please raise your right hand. Sir, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving will be the truth?
I do.
All right, and sir, for the record, can you please provide us with your first name and your last name and spell them for us?
Yes. First name is Victor, V-I-C-T-O-R. Last name is Murillo. Last name is M-U-R-I-L-L-O.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Kodiaga, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, Mr. Murillo.
Good morning.
Can you tell this jury what you do for a living?
Well, I'm currently employed as a criminalist part-time with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations State Crime Laboratory in Ankeny, Iowa.
Okay. And how long have you been employed in this position?
I began my employment in July of 1982. I spent 41 and a half years as a full-time employee of the crime laboratory. I actually retired at the end of 2023 and then was hired back. So I'm back working as a part-time employee, helping with some backlog, with some training, some other things. And I've been doing that for the last year or so.
Okay. As in the course of your duties with the crime lab, have you been in various positions, and what position were you last in, or are you in now?
Yeah, so in 1982, I started as a laboratory aide or laboratory assistant, where I helped with several different sections of the lab, working mostly in photography. In 1985, I became a criminalist. I began working arson, explosive cases, gunshot residue cases, trace evidence cases. In 1989, I became full-time in the firearms section, so began working with firearm-related evidence at that time, and have been doing that ever since.
Okay. What's your education background?
So I have an Associate of Arts degree in criminalistics from the Des Moines Area Community College in Ankeny. I took several classes that were kind of related to the different sections of the lab that I currently work in. So I had a firearm class, I had a fingerprint class, a drug class, so several different classes that were kind of related to what I do today. I also have a bachelor's degree from Drake University out of Des Moines. That degree program was kind of a general science program, so a lot of the criminalists are science majors, so either chemistry or biology or physics. So mine is kind of a combination, so I took all of those types of classes. So education-wise, formally, that was the extent of my background. Once you become employed in the laboratory, you're going to be assigned to a certain section of the lab, and then there's additional training that you will have to go through.
As a firearms and toolmark expert, have you testified as an expert in these in court and various cases in the state of Iowa?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Can you briefly tell the jury the science of firearms and toolmark that you do?
I'm sorry, the type?
Can you tell the jury briefly the science of firearms and how firearms work?
Yeah, so again, currently I'm assigned to the firearm and toolmark section of our laboratory, so most of what we are going to look at are going to be guns or firearms. We're going to test fire a lot of those guns, do some type of examination on them, and then we also look at a number of fired components. So a lot of fired bullets, fired cartridge cases, trying to match them to one another or match them eventually to a firearm.
So fair enough to say, in the course of your career, you've fired or test fired a lot of firearms.
Yes, so kind of depends on the day-to-day operation for me. And some days I will look at a dozen firearms in one day. In other cases, I might look at one gun in a week, depending on the case. So if there's a lot of other evidence that needs to be compared to that one firearm, it may take a full week to look at all of those other components before I eventually get to that gun. So over the years, yes, I've looked at thousands of firearms since 1982.
Okay. So I see that you're wearing what appears to be Apple headphones. Is that because you need that to help for your hearing?
Yes, I do have a hearing impairment, and these do help with my hearing, so I'm actually using them as a hearing aid. So I'm not listening to anything else. I don't have my phone with me, so I'm only listening to what's going on in the courtroom today.
Okay. I just wanted to clear that up with the jury in case someone's wondering why you have some headphones on.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to direct your attention to this particular case that we are here in this courtroom for. Were you at some point in charge of reviewing certain firearms or multiple firearms to test whether they were firearms consistent with a cartridge that had been found at the residence where Mr. Cooper had been shot?
Yes, I was the first one to get involved with the firearms evidence in this particular incident. So I looked at several items back in 2021.
Okay. And before we go into that, can you just, for the sake of the jurors who are not very familiar with firearms, can you just walk them through how a firearm works, the various components of a firearm, and the terminologies like bullets, cartridges that they've had? Just explain to them what those would be.
Yeah, so it's a little hard to explain a firearm because there are a lot of different types of firearms that out there. There are the old style revolvers where you have a cylinder that is filled with a number of different cartridges. Every time we pull the trigger, the gun fires, a wheel turns so that one of the chambers is in line with the barrel. Bullet goes down the barrel towards the target that we're aiming at. We release the trigger, pull it again, the cylinder rotates. Another cartridge, live round, is lined up with the barrel, fires, bullet goes down the barrel, and we can continue to do that until we fire all, usually like 5 or 6 of those cartridges in that cylinder. There are also semi-automatic pistols and rifles where we're going to have a magazine that is going to hold several cartridges at a time. Could be anywhere from 6 to 7 cartridges or live rounds of ammunition to 30 or more cartridges that are held in that magazine. That magazine is usually inserted into the bottom of the gun, whether it's a handgun or a rifle. And then there is a bolt or a slide that's going to be reciprocated. It moves back and forth on top of the firearm to cycle the ammunition from the magazine into the chamber. When it's fired, it pulls the fired cartridge case out of the chamber and ejects it. So it's left somewhere close to that weapon when it's discharged, but the bullet still goes down the barrel towards the target that we're aiming at. So every time we pull the trigger, the gun fires. There's nothing mechanical that happens other than that slide or that bolt moving back and forth. It chambers the round for us, and it extracts and ejects the fired cartridge case for us. So all we have to do is pull the trigger, and it fires. We release the trigger, pull the trigger again, and it will fire again until we've used up all of the ammunition in that magazine. So the ammunition is the live cartridges that we're talking about that go into that magazine or go into that cylinder. Ammunition is basically what we call a cartridge or a live round. So that cartridge is made up of 4 components. One is the cartridge case. Cartridge case is kind of like a cup, coffee cup, if you will, that holds all of the other components. At the bottom of that coffee cup or that cartridge case is a primer. It's a small pressure-sensitive explosive material that's imparted into the base of that cartridge case. So when we pull the trigger, the hammer goes forward or the firing pin goes forward, and it's going to strike that primer on the base of that cartridge case and cause a spark on the inside of that cartridge case. Inside of that cartridge case is going to be powder, smokeless powder. When that spark goes off from the primer, it's going to ignite the powder. That powder is going to burn, create a lot of pressure, and that's going to push the bullet, which is on the top of that cartridge, down the barrel and towards the target that we're aiming at. So that cartridge is made up of 4 components: the cartridge case, primer at the bottom, the powder on the inside, and the bullet or the projectile that's on the front or the forward end of that cartridge. When we fire the gun, the bullet is going to go down the barrel towards the target. The cartridge case is either going to be left inside of the gun and have to be manually removed, as in the revolver that we talked about, or it's going to be physically extracted and ejected by the gun, and it's going to be left somewhere close to that weapon when it's discharged. So those are the things that we're normally looking for at a crime scene. It's going to be the fired bullets, the fired cartridge cases that are going to be somewhere close or in the firearm. And then if they're outside of the gun, so we have fired bullets at a crime scene, fired cartridge cases at a crime scene, we can possibly match them to one another to try and determine whether they all came from the same gun or not. Or we can possibly try to match them to one specific firearm. Were they fired by this particular gun? So that's my job, is to look at those fired components, look at the firearms, try to determine sometimes whether those bullets and those cartridge cases came from that specific firearm.
Let's unpack a little bit of that. You've talked about cartridge casings. Is that what sometimes people call casings, or shell casings?
Yeah, it's known by a number of different nomenclatures, a little different for everybody. So yeah, it could be a casing. Sometimes we call it a cartridge case. I refer to it as a cartridge case.
Okay. But if there's a reference to a casing, it's pretty much synonymous to a cartridge case.
Yes, I would know what they were talking about. Yes, same thing.
And to be clear, that's what ejects in some firearms. When you fire, the bullet goes and the casings ejects from the gun.
Correct.
Okay. When the casing ejects from the gun, does it sometimes behave in an unpredictable manner in terms of where it will land or how it will travel?
Yeah, that cartridge case, when it ejects, is going to eject from that firearm differently for every firearm. Every gun ejects it in a different direction, a different distance. It kind of depends on the firearm. It depends on the ammunition. How powerful is that ammunition? It depends on how the gun is held, what position or what direction that gun is held as to where that cartridge case will end up as well. So there are a number of variables that are taken into consideration. If we find the cartridge case at a scene, we can kind of be general in getting an idea of where that cartridge case came from, where was the gun, but in some cases we may not be able to be very specific.
So in other words, yeah, if the flooring, the nature of the flooring, the way it bounces once it ejects out can affect where it lands and eventually ends up.
Yeah, again, that's another whole set of variables. Once it hits the floor, it is cylindrical in shape, so it will roll on a smooth floor. It will bounce, it will hit a wall, furniture, so it may not end up in the same position where it eventually fell after it was fired. It may get kicked out on a street. They get run over and get moved by vehicles and people walking. So, yeah, they could be in a different position once we're doing our investigation from where they originally fell at the time of the shooting. When you,
And I don't know if you talked about a caliber. What do we mean when we hear the term caliber weapon or something to that extent?
Yeah, so the caliber, or the cartridge name, refers to the ammunition that's being used. In this particular case today, we're going to talk about 22 caliber ammunition. So 22 caliber ammunition, same thing that we talked about before. It has a cartridge case. It has a priming material that's around the rim at the bottom of the cartridge case instead of being in the middle, but it still has powder, still has a bullet. So we still have a bullet that's being fired. We have a cartridge case sometimes that's going to be ejected, so nothing different. The 22 cartridge case, or the 22 cartridges, the live ammunition, is probably the smallest cartridge that we usually deal with at the laboratory, but it's also sometimes the most popular. It used to be the most popular cartridge that we would see in shooting cases.
And tell us more about that.
The 22 ammunition?
Yeah.
So yeah, again, back in the day, a long time ago when I started doing this type of casework, I saw a lot of revolvers. We didn't see a lot of semi-automatic pistols. So a lot of revolvers and a lot of 22 caliber cartridges. .22 ammunition is probably the most popular type of ammunition that's out there. You can find it almost everywhere. So as long as you have a .22 caliber cartridge and the gun is designed for .22 caliber ammunition, that cartridge should fit in that gun. So it doesn't make any difference who made it, who the manufacturer is. As long as the cartridge name and the designation for that firearm is the same, then they should be compatible with one another.
Can you tell the jury how toolmark comparison works?
I'm sorry, how?
Can you tell the jury how toolmark comparison works, how you compare firearms and what cartridge was used?
Sorry, I still didn't hear part of that.
Can you tell the jury what you do in terms of comparing a firearm and whether this particular cartridge was used in that firearm?
In a specific firearm?
Yes.
Okay. So when I look at the evidence in the case, I may look at a firearm, and so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a lot of information off of that gun, make, model, serial number. I'm going to check the safeties on the gun, make sure that everything is working correctly, and eventually that gun is going to be test-fired. We're going to produce test-fired bullets, test-fired cartridge cases from that firearm. Those are going to be my knowns. I know they came from that specific firearm because I just test-fired it. So those test-fired bullets, test-fired cartridge cases are my knowns that will eventually be used to compare to the unknowns. As I go through all of the unknowns, the bullets and cartridge cases from the scene, again, I'm taking a lot of notes, a lot of information is taken from each of them. The cartridge case, I'm going to look at it. I know that it's .22 caliber from the shape and the size. We can measure it. Look at the head stamp information so we know who manufactured that particular cartridge. I can look at the bullet, look at the diameter of the bullet, and the diameter should be roughly 22/100ths of an inch wide, so I know it's consistent with a .22 caliber bullet coming from a .22 caliber cartridge case or cartridge. I then begin looking at some of the information that's put on those items by the firearm. On the cartridge case, I'm looking at the firing pin impression. It could be a number of different shapes. It could be round or square or rectangular in shape. So I'll make a note of that as well. And then when I look at the bullet, not only do I look at the caliber and the diameter, but I'm going to weigh it, and I'm going to look at all of the rifling information that's present on that fired bullet. That bullet is going to go down the barrel of the firearm. The inside of the barrel is going to have spiral grooves that are on the inside of that barrel. As the bullet travels down the barrel, the outside of the bullet is going to come in contact with the rifling on the inside of the barrel. It's going to cause that bullet to spin with the rifling as it moves down the barrel. The inside of the barrel of the gun may have 6 grooves in it. It may have 5. It may have 22. The numbers are all different. It may spin the bullet clockwise. It may spin it counterclockwise. So you may have a right twist or it may have a left twist to it. So I can look at the firearm. I can count the number of lands and grooves in the barrel, look at the width of the rifling dimensions that are in that barrel, and then I'll also look at the bullet. Does it have the same number of land and groove impressions on it as what I'm seeing on the barrel? So if I have a bullet that is 6 land and groove impressions with a right hand twist, and I have a barrel that has 5 lands and grooves with a left hand twist, and I know that that bullet could not have come from that particular firearm. The class rifling characteristics are totally different. So that's my job initially when I'm looking at those items, to look at the cartridge case, firing pin information, breech face information, look at the bullet, take as much information off of that bullet as I can, the caliber, what the bullet is made of, whether it's lead or copper plated or brass plated, the rifling information that's present on it. I can count the number, I look at the direction, I can measure the dimensions of that rifling information. From all of that information, I can put it into a computer database and get an idea of the types of firearms, the makes and models of guns that could have fired that particular bullet. And that may be good investigative information that will usually show up in my report.
So in,
Mr. Kodiaga, I was going to actually stop you. I think now's a good time to take our mid-morning break. So we've been going a little over an hour and a half. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take approximately a 15-minute break at this point. And again, I would remind you of the admonition that I've given you previously. All right, so we are back on the record after our mid-morning break. We have our jurors, counsel, and parties present. Agent Murillo is on the stand. And, sir, even though we had a break, I would just remind you that you're still under oath. And with that, Mr. Kodiaga, you may resume your direct examination.
thank you. I think when we stopped, we discussed briefly about firearms, how they work, what your examination entails. And I don't know if you talked to the jury about the purpose of your examination in trying to find a firearm that has been, or a cartridge or a bullet that has been fired from a particular gun, and what that tells, whether guns or bullets tell a story based on what they leave behind. Can you just explain that briefly to the jury?
Yeah, so I think I talked a little bit about it. On that cartridge case, you're going to have a specific size and shape of the firing pin impression. On the bullet, you're going to have information that's there that we can look at and try to compare that to the rifling on the inside of the barrel of the gun of a suspect firearm. So those are the first things that we will look at. When we actually do a comparison, we're going to look at a little bit more. So when we get a firearm in, I'm going to test fire that gun. I'm going to place one of the test-fired cartridge cases underneath a comparison microscope, and then place an unknown underneath the microscope. I'll begin looking at both of those items at the same time, side by side. I'm going to begin looking at what we call unique individual characteristics that are inside of that firing pin impression. Tiny little scratches, impressions, tiny little markings, and the same thing on the bullet. The outside of the bullet will not only have that rifling information present, but there are going to be tiny little scratches and striations that come specifically from that barrel of that gun that it was fired from. So I begin looking at all the tiny little scratches and striations. It kind of looks like a little barcode, if you will. Little lines, thin lines, thick lines, deep lines, shallow lines. And there's a specific pattern that's going to be on every bullet that comes from that particular barrel. And that pattern is going to be unique to that particular firearm and will be different than the pattern that we will see on every other firearm. So that pattern that we're seeing on the fired bullet, the markings that we see on the cartridge case are going to be unique to a specific firearm. So we can look at the test fires from the gun, look at the unknowns, see if they have the same pattern. If they do, then we know that they came from that particular firearm, the unknowns. If they have a different pattern or different shape or different size or different number, then we know that that bullet or that cartridge case did not come from that particular firearm. So we can eliminate it. We can identify it and say, yes, it definitely came from that particular firearm. Sometimes it's inconclusive. You may be able to look at some of the markings and there's just not enough information there. I don't know whether it came from that gun or not. I'm just not sure because of damage, or maybe the gun just isn't producing any markings. There's a lot of different variables, again, that are taken into consideration. So we may call it inconclusive. And the fourth thing that we will sometimes look at is tiny little pieces of evidence that really have no value, and sometimes we'll say that they're unsuitable. So those are the four things that we normally will come to conclusion with when we look at those items. But hopefully what we can do is find the correct firearm and eventually match those bullets, cartridge cases, to a specific firearm.
As part of your job in this particular case, were you tasked with trying to find, there was, I believe, what you've referred to as a cartridge casing that was found at the scene of this crime. Were you trying to match that cartridge casing to certain guns that were delivered to you to see if those guns had been used to fire that cartridge casing?
Yes.
May I approach?
You may. And you don't need to ask again with this witness.
Then to find you what's been marked as State Exhibit 294. Do you recognize what 294 would be?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell the jury what 294 is?
Sorry, 294, State's Exhibit 294 is my item 6 as it came into the laboratory. This is a fired cartridge case that came from the scene, and one of the items that I initially looked at that's in my initial report.
So you identify 294 as the casing, what we've called casing, colloquially, or cartridge casing, that came from the scene that you were tasked with trying to find which firearm had fired that casing.
Correct.
We'll move to admit 294.
No objection, Your Honor.
294 is then admitted.
You've talked about that casing. You determined that that casing was fired from a 22.
Correct. So as we look at that cartridge case, I can tell that it is a 22 caliber, probably from a 22 long or a 22 long rifle cartridge. They both use the same cartridge case. And I can also see the manufacturer. I think this one was made by Winchester, which is a popular ammunition manufacturer. So all that information is in my notes, including the size and shape of that firing pin impression that we talked about. Because it is a fired cartridge case, it's going to have an impression from the firing pin when it hit, and so that information was also documented.
And when you say 22 long, that's a long rifle.
22 long or 22 long rifle, they are different, but they use the same cartridge case.
Now, did you have certain firearms that had been either retrieved from the scene or had been brought to you that you're trying to eliminate or find if they're the ones that had fired that cartridge casing?
Yeah, so initially I looked at 2 bullets. I looked at a fired cartridge case, and there was one firearm that was also submitted along with those items. So I compared those items to that one firearm initially.
And you said you looked at 2 bullets. Can you tell us what those were or what you looked at?
Those were, they're my items 20 and 21. They were bullets that came from the head of the decedent.
Okay. So bullet and bullet fragments that came from Mr. Cooper's head.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked as State Exhibit 296, 297, for the purposes of identification. Do you recognize what 296 and 97 would be?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury what they are?
Item 296 is my item 20. There are actually 2 different bullets, 22 caliber bullets that were in that item. And then State's item 297 is my item 21. 21 is some tiny little fragments of lead that were, in this case, they were unsuitable. They just didn't have any information on them. But an additional fragments that also came from the head as well.
And your lab is also attached to the State Medical Examiner's office, correct?
Yes.
Now, when you examine, first I'll move to admit 296 and 297.
Any objection to 296 or 297?
No, Your Honor.
296 and 297 are then admitted.
You observed, thank you. You observed 296 and 97. Can you describe to the jury what the characteristics or what you observed in this, what has been admitted as 296 and 97?
So I kind of talked about 297. Again, it's just tiny little fragments that were unsuitable. There's no rifling information. I couldn't get a caliber, nothing. It's just very, very small fragments of lead that were of no value. The other item, 296, my item 20, there's actually 2 different bullets in there, 2 fired bullets. And so those 2 items are the ones that I looked at. Take the information, rifling information off of those. I weighed them, looked at the composition, all of that. They were very similar to one another, had the same type of rifling on them. Again, 22 caliber bullets coming from a 22 caliber firearm of some sort.
Were they in a damaged condition, or what was their physical condition?
Yeah, I took photographs of them as well, but yes, they were flattened, or the nose, front end of the bullet was flattened quite a bit, kind of mushroomed out. So they were distorted and damaged from impact, and that's pretty normal when a bullet hits something very hard, especially something like this bullet. These bullets, again, are made out of lead. Lead is very soft, so when it hits something hard, it tends to smash and become much more distorted than a copper-jacketed bullet or a brass-jacketed bullet that we will see in other types of ammunition. So not unusual that it was flattened and distorted, but it still had a little bit of rifling information there that I could base some information on.
When you compared the cartridge casing, did you have some firearms then that you tested to see if they were consistent with the cartridge casing that you found, that was found at the scene?
Yeah, so I looked at the bullets, again, compared them to one another. I gave some investigators some information about the gun that they were looking for. There was one firearm that was submitted with these items. It was a Savage rifle that I believe was found at the scene. So I compared these items to that rifle, and that rifle was eliminated as the firearm that was used to fire these items.
And when you say at the scene, fair enough to say it wasn't at the scene where Mr. Cooper was dead, but in that home in Traer.
Yeah, I meant in general. I think it may have been found in another building or something, but it was part of that original search that was done. There was a 22 caliber rifle that was found, so they submitted it. I looked at it, but it was not the correct rifle.
In fact, if your report says it was found in the safe in the red garage, will that be fair and accurate?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so this Savage Arms Rascal bolt action 22 was in a safe in the red garage, and you compared it with that casing that was found inside the house or next to the door, and it was not the firearm that had fired that shell casing.
That is correct.
Did you compare another firearm or any other firearm?
Yeah, there were 3 other firearms that were submitted. One about a month later, I think it was a Ruger pistol. And then another year or 2 later, there were 2 additional firearms, another Ruger rifle, and also a Marlin rifle that were submitted. So I looked at all of those firearms as well, compared them to these items, these unknown items, and did a comparison of those items as well.
And what was your findings from comparing these firearms to that cartridge casing that was known?
Those additional firearms were also eliminated as a suspect firearm, so they were not used to fire the bullets or cartridge cases in this incident.
Okay, they were not the firearms that killed Ryan Cooper.
Correct.
When you looked at the casings and the bullet, were you trying to also find, as you've talked about, that you're trying to look at various firearms or trying to talk to your investigators to look for particular firearms? Were you trying to rule or find which firearm could have fired those bullets?
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier, I can look at the cartridge case, look at that rifling information that's on the bullets, measure the dimensions of that rifling information. It can be entered into a computer database. We actually have a couple of different computer databases that we use, and those databases will tell us all of the makes and models of guns that have those specific dimensions in their barrels. So that particular list was actually very long. It was several pages long, hundreds of firearms that had that 22 caliber, 6 lands and groove, right hand twist, the width of the dimensions that I found on all of those hundreds and hundreds of firearms that were on that list. So that list was generated. It's part of my notes, and also in my report, I indicated there is a long list of firearms that could have been used to fire this particular bullet. Hopefully, in some cases, we like to narrow it down so we say this is the one gun that you're looking for, but unfortunately, the 22 caliber, six right rifling that we found on these bullets is probably the most popular rifling dimensions that we see on 22 caliber rifles. So there are a lot of firearms that have those dimensions, but there was a list that was generated.
Did that list include a Ruger 1022?
Yes, there was a Ruger 1022 that was on the list that originally generated.
So as part of what you generated and what you're looking for was a possibility of this being that the bullets that killed Ryan Cooper came from a Ruger 1022 long
Yes,
rifle.
that is one possibility, yes.
Now, how loud is a Ruger 1022 long rifle in a closed, small living room space?
Well, any firearm is going to be extremely loud, especially in a small room. Sound waves are going to bounce off of the walls, so you're going to hear it much more loudly, if I can say it that way. So it's going to be kind of the equivalent of a very large firecracker if it were to go off in that room. Every gun is a little bit different. Depends on what's in the room, what the walls are made of, what furniture is in there. So it's a little different for every scene, but it's going to be extremely loud.
But in a wall that's not from, there's no reason to believe it's soundproof or anything to that extent, and a small room, in the quiet of the night, it will be a loud sound.
Yes, it will.
And 2 shots from a Ruger 1022 long rifle would be two loud sounds.
Yeah, you should hear 2 distinct loud pops or loud bangs, if you will, that are coming from those 2 shots that are being fired.
I have no further questions at this time.
Cross-examination?
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, I don't think you were part of any investigation of firearms that were seized in 2024. Is that right?
No, the firearms I looked at were submitted in 2021 and 2023. I remember there were no. I was not working in 2024. I think I mentioned I retired at the end of 2023. So anything that came into the laboratory in 2024 would have been examined by another individual.
And when you talk about sound, there are ways of muffling sounds of firearms.
Yes.
And the other thing that can affect whether or not something's loud in any given environment would be if somebody's running a fan or something like that. It would muffle it, at least to them.
Yeah, if there's other sounds in the room, that could, it's not going to make the sound of the gun any less, but it's going to kind of drown out what you're trying to hear. Yes.
It's going to obscure your hearing of it, right?
It could,
Yeah.
yes.
And the 22, that's a small caliber bullet.
It is, yes.
And I assume since the projectile that it has to get moving down that barrel is one of the smallest, that the amount of powder that's needed to make that happen is less than larger caliber bullets.
Yes.
And oftentimes the sound is related to that kind of mini explosion that happens in the chamber, right?
Yes.
Nothing further, Judge. Thank you.
Anything further?
We just have a minute, Judge.
You may.
Nothing else from the state. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir. You may step down. You're excused.
Thank you.